There was dancing on the streets and festive scenes in Beirut and the southern Lebanese city of Sidon. The resignation of the Prime Minister, Hariri, welcomed by protesters who have been on the streets since October 17th. Welcome, but not enough, say many of the demonstrators. They want a full overhaul of the country's leadership. International reactions have been mixed, with France voicing concern over the resignation. Well, let's cross now live to Molana-Allen in Beirut to get the latest. Leila, of course, the big question now is, will this resignation be enough?
Well, this is just the problem, that for the protesters, it isn't enough. It might have been a few weeks ago when they began, but what they're calling for is, as you said, a complete overhaul of the political system. They want all these dynastic politicians gone. This is what they're complaining about. They're saying that for 30 years since the end of the Civil War in 1990, they have seen these sectarian groups use the divisions against the people to try and get them to only support these particular families who have always led the particular sector. And what protesters want is an entirely different system. Ideally, they say, a non-sectarian system, a true democracy in which it is simply representative of everyone's vote and people aren't divided up by their faiths. Now, that's an incredibly difficult thing for them to achieve, but that's what they're still fighting for. They have had a head, so to speak, role with Hariri, but there are several other politicians that they really want gone. One of them is Foreign Minister Gibran Bassi. He is the most unpopular politician in Lebanon, more so than Hariri. And the problem is that he is the son-in-law of President Michel Aoun, and so it's very unlikely he will go. One of the issues over the last week has been that Prime Minister Hariri has been desperately trying to reorganize the cabinet, trying to get a few people to step down and replace them with technocrats, as the protesters have been demanding, to try and keep this cabinet and this government going. And President Aoun has continually said, in any cabinet, Gibran Bassi must still be in it. So he is a major sticking point. There are several other very unpopular politicians, and if a few more of them did resign, it's possible that we would see a change in the protesters' demands. But for now, most of them are still saying all of them means all of them. We want them all to go.
But this resignation, Leila, it does leave for the immediate future a political vacuum of sorts. What's likely to happen now?
It does. It's important to point out that even though Prime Minister Hariri tendered his resignation to President Aoun yesterday, it has not yet been officially accepted. The President's office said that they are analysing it today. He's going to meet with different ministers, presumably to try and figure out what they can do in this situation. Now, I've been speaking to some constitutional lawyers who say that actually in the Lebanese constitution, there is no provision for the president to refuse the resignation of a prime minister. People have been pointing to 2017, when Saad Hariri resigned, famously, of course, when he was in Saudi Arabia. Many people say he was kidnapped and held there and forced to resign. But the difference there was, firstly, that he was abroad. He didn't tender his resignation in person to the president. And also, of course, there were suspicions that he was being forced to do it, that he was being lent upon by a foreign power. This is a different situation. So if that is accepted, as we presume it will be, there are a few things that could happen. The first thing that could happen is the current parliament, because of course the cabinet falls, the current parliament can try to elect a new prime minister and see if they can keep functioning under the current government as it was elected last year. That is very unlikely, with all these sectarian groups fighting against each other about who they can all unite to support as prime minister. Of course, we have Hezbollah there and Amal, the other Shia group, and then we have the Christian groups, and then we have the Sunni groups, the major one of which was the Future Movement, which is Saad Hariri's party. So whether they would all be able to come together along with the other smaller factions and decide on somebody is very unclear. The other possibility is that the president says to Saad Hariri, okay, but you need to be in charge of a caretaker government until the point that we're able to elect and put in a new cabinet. Now, the problem for Saad Hariri, if that happens, is that he would have such limited bureaucratic powers under a caretaker government that he couldn't address any of the huge economic and social problems that the protesters are talking about. So that's the political situation with the current politicians. The other side of it is civil society. What protesters are saying, particularly the die-hard activists who've been fighting for change for years, is that they want an entirely new political system, as I said, getting rid of these factional divides, this sectarian voting system. But that will take a lot of time, and there is no heir apparent at the moment from that civil society. They did try and field independent candidates last year in the election. There was much excitement, and in the end, not many of them were actually able to get in. So we will see whether they're able to come up with some viable candidates if we move into a situation where they're looking for entirely new politicians.
And briefly, Leila, before we let you go, one thing, of note is the role of Hezbollah going forward. It came out vocally against that protest movement. Where do they stand in it all now?
Yes, by many people's opinions here, Hezbollah has not played this one well. They are in a difficult situation because traditionally they are the party of the common man. They represent the disenfranchised Shia in the south. Hassan Nasrallah defines himself as very separate from all the other elite politicians. And in this situation, with these protests, he came out a couple of weeks ago, the day after they started, and he said, we must continue to back this government. And then he had to speak again a week later, just this past Friday. And he is not a man who is used to having to repeat himself. And he had to come out again and say, please do not continue protesting like this. I appreciate what you're complaining about, but we need to support this government. And of course, the reason he's doing that is that right now Hezbollah has more power in this present parliament than they have ever had before, because they did very well in the last election, and they don't want to lose that. He used every tactic in the book in that speech. He talked about how another civil war was coming, warning that people were setting up checkpoints and checking IDs, which of course is something that's famously a terrible memory from people from that period. He also talked about how foreign powers were influencing the protests, and he talked about how salaries would not be paid, jobs would be lost. So, and people again didn't really listen to him. So right now the choice that he has to make is whether they continue in this current parliament, they try and create another cabinet, and they really have to give up their reputation, their image as the resistance movement and be part of the politicians, or whether they pull back and they say, okay, we are not going to be involved in this parliament anymore, and we're going to support the protesters on the street.
Okay, Leila, for now, thanks very much for that. Leila Molana-Allen there reporting for us live from Beirut.